I won't mention them all, but you can look around and see all kinds of neat stuff that's on loan to the museum, for the convention. Anyway, we appreciate you all, and thank you very much for everything you've done. Let's have a round of applause for everything. Oh, and one more thing. I also want Larry McIntyre, who is running around doing all kinds of things. I need to, even though he's off doing something right now.
Bring him food.
Yeah, somebody's supposed to bring him food, is what I heard. So, right. So anyway, I'll turn this over to Don now, and enjoy yourselves, and we will see you the next 2 days.
Thank you, Steve. And again, thank all of you. During the break, Brother Folsom is going to circulate the tables. So would you kindly get out your checkbooks? The museum that we all appreciate was founded and single-handedly financed by Steve. And he's done one heck of a job, but it's no longer a tourist attraction only. As you can see, Steve arranged to get the Hawkeye Company equipment. One day, that plant will be in operation in the back of the museum. Behind the white line that's painted on the floor, there'll be a room built. I want all of you who are in the hobby, and I've made some inquiries, and I struck out. Nobody in America is making rebuilt CRTs. There has to be some places that still have a supply of guns, of tubes, of duds, of anything that it was used in the remanufacture. We should be scrounging and recapturing all of that equipment because it cannot be used commercially anymore. So the value has dropped down, and even if you have to pay a few modest dollars, donate it to the museum, buy it. Steve will give you a deduction for your income tax next year. But we have to assemble a stockpile of inventory. There is some equipment, I understand, I don't know exactly how much, that came with Hawkeye's equipment that will be a pilot program to rebuild a couple of black and whites. Jerome will tell you, if you circulate in the museum, the RAC's success in finally settling down and accepting 15 Gs on a production basis for rebuilding. I have a number of them, other collectors have a number of them. I want to get my 15 Gs to France by the summer so that they can be built. And hopefully before RACS goes out of business, because this is a dying art, CRT reproduction. We all have CRT sets. They're worthless without a good tube. And I've been scrounging around for years, picking up all the 15 Gs I can, and I've got 5 of them now, just to be rebuilt as spares for the CT100s and the other early sets. Pete Dexness has done one heck of a job finding 135 surviving CT100s, but only about 30 tubes that are working. So we have about 100 collectors that need 15 Gs. I would advise you to get them to France and talk to Jerome and find out how he will accept them at the factory and get it done. And he's got a price he'll talk to you about. And shipping, of course, is extra. And insurance is definitely needed so that they don't drop off the truck. But I'm very happy that things are progressing. Ingo, you have something good you want to tell us?
Yeah, just a little remark about this. I brought a box with me in which I shipped 15 Gs 2 times over the ocean already. It can be seen in the museum, and you can build your own boxes like this if you are interested. I mean, it's just, yeah. And I also wanted to suggest put about 5 of them in one wooden crate and then ship it off. That makes it much, much cheaper than if everybody sends it by themselves. So, I mean,
Build a box.
Yeah.
And make sure it's insulated.
Yeah, that's why I brought it, to show you guys. I mean, I shipped 2 of these tubes to Germany and then back here. and they both survived. And so, I mean, I guess the box is not bad. Well,
It
but-
works. It
Okay.
works.
Also, sorry that I interrupted
no,
you,
no,
but
that's
I just
good
wanted to
news.
get this information out.
Well, that's what, Ingo, that's what a hobby is for. One person helps another person, helps another person. And this is important. I've been involved in other hobbies where if I needed spare parts, I had to pay through the nose. In this hobby, if I need something desperately, there's always somebody who will give me a part, and I will give them a part. It's a great human attitude that we all have in this particular hobby, and I thank you all for doing that. Steve's helped me over the years when I first got a CT100, and Pete Dexness helped me with spare parts. It's a great feeling, and I encourage you to keep it up. Well, enough of my baloney. Let me start the presentations. We have some really great topics today that you will enjoy. None of the topics are going to be over your head. You don't have to be an engineer or a brain surgeon to enjoy today's presentations. Mr. James O'Neill, you're up first. And I can't even read James's accomplishments off this piece of paper. He's a technology genius working in the industry for most of his adult life, and knows more about the entire industry than I know about how to bake pizza bread, you know. But Jim, why don't you come up, give us a 20-second rundown of yourself, and then your presentation is waiting. Yeah.
Pointer here if anybody wants it.
Okay. You want to carry the mic and point things at the screen?
Here. I've got
Okay,
some notes.
great.
Okay, I think a lot of you guys out there and ladies, James O'Neill. Let's see, I'm not good at introducing myself, but I was in the field of broadcast television engineering for close to 37 years. Okay, that better? That better? Can everybody hear now? Okay. So I worked in the field of broadcast engineering, specifically television work, for close to 37 years. Retired in 2005. It's hard for me to make the transition to this 21st century thing. Retired 2005, stayed retired for all of 3 weeks, started a second career as technology editor for TV Technology magazine. Gave me a chance to do a lot of writing, a lot of research, meeting some of the people in the industry that I had read about, and now I'm writing about them. So that's what I do this day and age, and I collect also and do some restoration when I don't have anything else hanging loose. Well, the presentation I'm going to do is rather unusual. Let me go ahead and see if I can bring it up here. Well, okay, I'm looking all over. Oh, it's a remote control?
Yeah, if you want to use the remote.
Okay,
Which
I
was
was-
yours again now? It was called Granville, right?
Yeah, Randall, yeah. Should do it. Okay. Yeah, the Granville Klink's wonderful collection of broadcast memorabilia and his involvement in early television. Well, I think the title is probably longer than the presentation, one of these types of things. This is not heavily technical. I know Steve had contacted me early on, since I presented here before, asked me if I would come up with a presentation. I said, Steve, I really don't have anything cooking I think would be of great interest to the crowd there, and turned him down. Well, a few weeks later, I made a discovery and doing some research on something else, and I called him back, said, I think I can put together something that may have a little bit of interest for the people there, and that's what I've come up with. Presentation. Looks like we're losing interlace or something here in the projector. the squigglies. Somebody want to hit it with a shoe? Okay, well, big question, all of us. Who was Granville Klink? Okay, show of hands. I want to see how many people know the name Granville Klink. You from the Washington, D.C. area? Put your hand down. Okay, nobody knows. Unsung hero. Okay, well, I'll tell you a few things about Mr. Klink. First off, he's not well known in even broadcasting or television engineering circles. While he did have a rather long career in broadcasting, it began in the 1920s and ended with his death in 1997 at the age of 87. From all indications, it really wasn't that remarkable. Able to deduce, Klink's career track basically followed persons who were involved in the engineering side of broadcasting during the 20th century. He seems to have been your basic ordinary man who had a love for electronics and radio and built a career around that love. However, Klink's career was slightly different from that of many early radio engineering people. He was one of the few who made a successful transition into television when television burst upon the land in large quantities after World War II. He was not there alone. Certainly there were other radio men who made the transition, but Klink is one of the few that documented. Did we lose everything? No. Okay, I thought it blanked out. Anyway, Klink did make the transition. I'm going to talk about that. That's what.
A little lower res, maybe.
Okay.
See if that'll help.
So much for high def.
Yeah, we'll run it at a lower res and see if it likes that.
Just keep it 4:3, please. Anyways, I was saying Klink did make the transition into television engineering, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about him. But let's go back and look at some stats on the man. He was born in the Germantown area of the Philadelphia suburb in 1909. Like a lot of teenagers, a lot of young men, young women too, a few young women at the time, he was very interested in radio when radio entered the home in the early 20s. That decade he got his amateur radio license, and he also got a commercial license, so he was lined up for a job in radio when one opened up at WIBG, which was licensed then to Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. The station was put on the air by a church. It only operated Sunday mornings, and they brought Granville Klink in to run transmitter since he had a commercial license. By the way, the call letters, I think maybe some of people out here from South Jersey area, Philly area, remember Wibbage as being a dominant rocker, top 40 radio station there in the 50s and 60s. Well, it started out with rather in a different direction, owned by a church, as I said. According to Klink, the call letter stood for "I believe in God." Other people, according to Klink, said the call letter stood for "Will I bring gin?" So you make up your own mind. Well, a few years later, Wibbage, the Federal Radio Commission, wanted the station to remain on the air more than hours Sunday morning. The church couldn't do it, so the station was sold off to commercial interest. And Klink and a friend of his who had started a radio repair business at the time found themselves immersed rather deeply in broadcasting. Now you have to remember this was the time we're going into the Great Depression, 1929, 1930, and the new owner of the station really couldn't turn it into a paying proposition, so they gave Klink and his friend 49% of Wibbage. I mean, imagine what that would be worth, 40, 50 years after that, but they gave him the 49% share of the station, and Klink and his friend ran the radio shop for a couple of years, but again, times were pretty tight, there's not much money, and as he put it later, he said it was hardly worth the effort. So they both bowed out and went their separate ways. The friend continued to repair radios. Klink got a job with another station, worked a few stations, moving up like a lot of us did in broadcasting, and then finally grabbed the proverbial brass ring. He got a job in 1937 with a CBS owned and operated station in Washington, WJSV. I'm going to talk about that station because it's sort of an interesting station here. The DC station that hired Klink was originally founded in Brooklyn, New York in 1926 by a political organization which was a splinter group of the mainline Republican Party. This is what makes it interesting. It had ties to the Ku Klux Klan. According to some research done by a friend of mine, James Snyder, the station was actually bankrolled by one James S. Vance, who was a grand wizard in the Klan and who founded a publication called the Fellowship Forum, the voice of the Ku Klux Klan in America. Well, things got a little hot politically in Brooklyn, so Mr. Vance decided to move his operation to a D.C. suburb in Virginia and move the station there too. The call letters at the time were WTFF, standing for the Fellowship Forum, his Klan publication. Well, Vance got permission to go from 50 watts, which he started with, to 10,000 watts, but found that the revenues weren't sufficient to pay his bills. So he entered into an agreement Columbia Broadcasting System, who wanted a presence in the nation's capital, to let them use the station. They were going to pay the bills, and he kept the license. Well, this went on for a while, but CBS quickly realized things were not quite what they should be in terms of propriety. As Mr. Snyder put it in his writings about WJSV, said the FCC file implied that CBS rather quickly realized they were in bed with the Klan, and negotiations started in 1931 to purchase the station and licenses outright by CBS, and they did. So goodbye Klan, hello WJVS. But interestingly enough, they kept the call sign that it had changed to JSV, James S. Vance, for quite a while. But enough about that. Anyway, Klink was lucky enough to go to work for the CBS O&O station in 1937. It's been a Cinderella experience. Here you have somebody working at flea power stations. He's now working for a full power station owned by the great Columbia Broadcasting System. And he noted that when he started work there, he was assigned to the station's field bureau. It meant he got to go out and do with performers such as Benny Goodman, the New York Philharmonic, Glenn Miller, Gene Autry, Tony Pastor, Abe Lyman, and many, many others. He then moved into studio work and was assigned to engineer for the likes of Fred Waring and Arthur Godfrey. He was one of Godfrey's favorite engineers. They had a lifelong relationship there. Klink did a lot of work on the side for Godfrey because, again, he was a very capable engineer. Well, he took on increasing roles in the corporation, moving up the corporate ladder, later becoming chief engineer of the whole WTOP AM, FM, and TV conglomeration, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I will add he was an amateur radio operator too when he died. His call sign was W3AFV. But anyway, what distinguishes Klink? What makes him special? Why are we talking about him? Why am I talking about him today? Why are you here listening? Well, I dug around. I really couldn't find anything that set him apart. I couldn't find any evidence he'd ever invented or patented anything, aside from writing notes for a house newsletter. He only published 2 articles. These were fairly small. One was co-authored. He did an article on an antenna installation, and he did a piece in RCA Broadcast News. He did a section on the write-up they did on the TOP broadcast house facility. Now, I will say the WJSV, not to confuse you, changed call in 1943 when they got the authorization to go 50,000 watts and move up to what was then the top of the dial. So they made a deal with the Tiffin, Ohio Police Department for the call sign WTOP, Tiffin, Ohio Police. Paid a considerable amount of money to get this call sign from the police department in Tiffin and moved the call to Washington, and Mr. Vance's legacy was totally gone by that time. So I'm going to refer to it as TOP from now on. And when you think about it, Klink starting with WTOP in 1937, he was still working for the station, even though indirectly, when he died in 1997. So how many people have a career with one job basically for 60 years? So that sort of makes him remarkable, but that's not why I'm going to talk about him today. Okay, aside from what I found, he did deliver one paper at the National Association of Broadcasters conventions on some automation gear they had bought from, but there was nothing else really that set him apart. However, I made this discovery a few years ago that makes him and his career in broadcasting something very special. When it came to paper, the man was an inveterate pack rat. Now, I thought I was badly afflicted by the disease of collecting and saving paper. My wife reminds me quite often I've got a problem. However, I can't possibly put a candle to what this man did in his lifetime. He was truly a paper saver of the first water. Well, this is the place where he worked. This is where he kept a lot of his things that weren't at home. And having lived in the D.C. area for more than 30 years, I knew that Klink was involved in the WTOP organization, but I really didn't know about his proclivity for saving paper until I toured this station facility just a few years ago. I was given a tour, and there's a lot of interesting stuff there, bits and pieces of equipment, some interesting whole equipment, even part of the original transmitter from the late 1930s. But I was asked, I said, would you like to see the Granville Klink collection? I said, I didn't know there was a Granville Klink collection. Well, I was walked over, and there are some sagging shelves. There are over 60 scrapbooks, each with 60 double-sided pages, the plastic type you slide things under. It seems Klink got religion in the last few years of his life and began sorting through and organizing things. And before it was over, he'd filled completely over 60 scrapbooks, papers, pictures, other memorabilia collected during his lifetime. Now, this is not all really good stuff. I mean, there's a lot of chaff mixed in with the wheat, but there's enough wheat in there to make this rather interesting. So I'm, by the way, I'm still scratching the surface. I've gone back to the site several times. I've only gone through just less than 10 of these volumes. They're not well organized. It's hard to find things, and there's a lot of junk in there. I mean, the man even saved the vaccination licenses for his pets. They're there. Go figure. But there's enough about broadcasting history here to really make it interesting, and I think you'll find the same thing too. Just give you an idea what I consider mundane. Here's a WTOP radio operating log from September 28, 1945. Now, why he kept this, I have no idea. I even went to this, on this day in history, trying to see if that date, September 28, 45, was significant. I couldn't find a reason why he kept it. Here's another good example of trivial. The guy kept his boarding passes when he flew with airlines. Yeah. Well, he says something here. He did have a note about this. He said, airline passage ticket receipts used in the pursuit of happiness and my job for WTOP, AM, FM, and TV. And he also made note of the good old days about flying for the station when the Washington Post owned the business. Klink said, we owned a DC-3 aircraft fitted out with easy chairs and coaches with a bar and television set and a hostess. This was delightful flying, being able to relax in an easy chair while watching television and having drinks. So I wonder what he would think of air travel this day and age. Well, he also saved party invitations, newspaper clippings about people he'd worked with, just about anything else that he could put between the pages of a scrapbook. There's a whole page there. It's nothing but the 4 memos while you were out. His secretary wrote down messages while he was out of the office for one day. So this was a kind of string saver, paper saver this guy really was. Well, looking at some of the more interesting things, the front of the station there's the stars and stripes, and under it the WJSV, WCBS flag. I mean, how many times have you seen this flying in front of a radio or television station in the last 30, 40 years? So, interesting picture. Here's another one I find rather interesting. Let me find my pointer here. The man kneeling down with a microphone in his hand is a very young Robert Trout, Bob Trout, CBS correspondent, newsman extraordinaire for a long time. I don't know who the stern gentleman is here, but the man up on the rostrum is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, speaking into a couple of RCA 4A condenser microphones. Very interesting picture. I imagine Klink was off camera, probably running this 100-pound plus Western Electric mixer he referred to in some of his notes. He may have taken the picture, we don't know. Another picture involving Robert Trout. This, by the way, shows this remote amplifier, this mixer, 100 pounds worth. There's Robert Trout with a pipe in his mouth. Can we get the lights dimmed? I think these things will look a lot better if we could drop the lights down. Is that possible? I'm getting a lot of backwash. No? Okay. Anyway, the person with the headphones on who's engineering the broadcast, that is Clyde Hunt, who was later going to become one of Klink's bosses in the CBS and WTOP, WJSV, WTOP structure. Here's another photo I found sort of interesting. Same person. That's Mr. Vance. This is Johnny Salb. Arthur Godfrey referred to him many times in his broadcast. He was a legendary staff organist. Yes, radio stations had staff musicians to fill when they lost their network feeds or at any other time. What looks like a mannequin is not really a mannequin. It's his hands. Klink identified him as Robert Trout. Sleeping. Well, this is a stage picture. There was an early morning show at WJSV called the Sundial Show, and this was an obviously staged picture. But what Klink said in his notes were the pajama business, you know, they're all in pajamas. The pajama business is not as exaggerated as it seems. Trout has been known to appear in public in pajamas. He also added, I loaded Bob Trout on the FDR presidential train more than once dressed in his red flannel pajamas while we were traveling on the road with FDR. That's something else that distinguished Klink. He got to travel with the presidential entourage going to the White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, when Roosevelt would go there. And he originated a lot of the fireside chats that Roosevelt did from the White House. Well, let's move along. Those are radio shots. We're television people, so we're gonna look at this saved. This is a 1952 Packard, which has been specially fitted out for mobile television origination. That's Walter Cronkite standing there with a microphone. You see the microwave link there, the button hook feed, the camera. This was probably the first vehicle that was capable of transmitting video while in motion. I mean, it's fairly common now, but I think this had to be a first. This was used, according to Klink, in the 1952 Eisenhower presidential inauguration parade. So I mentioned Klink was involved early on in television. Well, how early? Well, we go back to 1931. He and four of his ham friends put an amateur television station on the air there in Germantown, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. According to the newspaper article, they were doing, I'm quoting here, doing original work in the field of television and were licensed to transmit on 1,740 kilocycles with 50 watts of power, of course, just above the AM broadcast band, almost up in 160 meters. This is Klink here in the corner, young Granville Klink sitting down. It's a little blocked up here, but this is the Nipkow scanning disc of their television transmitting apparatus. Klink noted that they, in addition to building the scanner for the transmitter, they built other receivers. They built probably half a dozen receivers, distributed these to other friends and some of the neighbors around their transmitting site. He said, we never got any reports of reception from anybody other people we had loaned the receivers to, but on occasion we did receive a lot of other television being transmitted, including that from C. Francis Jenkins station, W3XK in Wheaton, Maryland. Now, here's a letter in connection with the station, and it's a little hard to read, but from the Department of Commerce. It's signed by George Sterling. At the time, this is 1931, it's dated April 16th. Apparently, they're going to move the station. They have applied for a form to move this amateur television station, relocate it. The FCC did not exist in 1931. The Federal Radio Commission came into being in 1926, but it did not issue licenses. The Department of Commerce, who had the first jurisdiction over radio regulation in the country, was still issuing station licenses and modifications. Sterling later became an FCC commissioner. He was there during the CBS-RC, and he's mentioned in George Brown's book, in part of which I was, as the only commissioner who had an engineering background. Well, one thing that makes this letter especially interesting is the last paragraph. It says the operation of television apparatus is permitted by amateurs in accordance with yada, yada, yada. But he says the operation of television apparatus for commercial purposes is covered by other regulations, and if you're interested in such operation, information will be furnished upon request. I find this rather interesting since I don't think commercial television was really what we would think of as being able to go out and sell commercials. That didn't happen until 1941, as far as I know. But it's rather interesting to see the government is doing something to get them smacked of commercialism in television as early as 1931. But there it is in this letter that Klink had saved from George Sterling. Klink also, let's see, we're back where we started. Okay. Klink also mentioned that Farnsworth, Philo Farnsworth, had moved to Philadelphia about the time they set the station up. I guess a lot of you know that story. He went to work for Philco. They didn't get along too well, so Farnsworth went off on his own and set up a television lab and eventually set up a television station in a suburb of Philadelphia. Well, Klink wrote some notes about Farnsworth. He said he had started experimental television work in his laboratory in the outskirts of Germantown, some 4 or 5 miles from our amateur television station. We happened to be acquainted with one of his lab technicians, and through him tried to set up a visit to the laboratory. According to our friend, Philo had heard of our television venture and was not about to let us see what he was doing. I suppose this is because he'd been burned a few years before when he let Zworykin into his lab at Green Street, San Francisco, and I think even before the train ride was over getting Zworykin back to Philadelphia, he telegraphed and phoned ahead, and they had built some reverse-engineered image dissectors there at the laboratory. So Farnsworth was quite a bit more secretive about his operations, not even letting these bunch of young people in to see what he was doing. Well, found some other letters, papers relevant to television there. This is a letter from Elihu Thompson of General Electric to C. Francis Jenkins, dated November 28, 1922, discussing prismatic rings that Jenkins used in his scanner. Another letter here in Klink's collection, dated 1924, February 1. This is from Herbert Hoover, who at the time was Secretary of Commerce, Department of Commerce. acknowledging some photographs of his television apparatus sent him. Here's a newspaper clipping that Klink had saved, 1925. Again, it refers to the transmission of motion pictures by radio that Jenkins was doing there at his station in D.C. and later in Wheaton. I don't think those are original letters. They look like copies, but it's still interesting that Klink was interested in television even as a young man and a teenager in the 1920s to have gotten copies of these letters, saved the clippings and everything else. Well, don't know too much about Granville. He did work a few stations. He took time off, I believe, for a stint in the Merchant Marine. This picture was taken during that stint. That's one of the more interesting things I found, too. I'm surprised somebody hasn't stolen it. But he mentions sailing into, I think he's probably the radio officer, sailing into Havana in the 30s. He went into a curio store, and there was a large, old denomination, $1, the silver certificate. The bills used to be much larger. And he bought it for a small amount and brought it back and kept it. That's in one of the scrapbooks, too. I'm surprised nobody stole that dollar bill. It's probably worth quite a bit to a collector now. Well, as I said, he did move into the radio operation. They built this unique building. It's a building in the round. I'm there, but that's where these albums are stored, and that's where Klink spent a lot of his time over the years. That WJSV becoming WTOP when they went up to 50,000 watts. Well, we're going to move ahead now, get Mr. Klink out of radio into television. Of course, the great television boom descended upon the land after World War II, and Klink was part of it. This picture was not labeled, not captioned at all, but I have a feeling this possibly was the first television receiver in the Klink household. He mentioned loving animals. That's probably the family cat there. It's a General Electric. I've never seen this receiver. Does anybody recognize it? Okay. It does have channel 1 and does have the requisite radio tuning. So what was going on in D.C.? Well, we had a couple of television stations then, but we had the freeze come along and capped everybody off in 1948. A station or a construction permit, you weren't going to get one until anything going till 1952. Well, the Washington Post had bought part interest from CBS. CBS owned WTOP radio, and they were wanting to get into television. They pushed the deal. Actually, Washington Post ended up owning WTOP completely before it was all over, but they wanted a television presence. Because of the freeze, the only way to get a station was to buy one. And there was a station in D.C. at the time called WOIC. I like that call, OIC, Channel 9, owned by a group that had a station on the air in New York City. So they cut a deal to buy the station. Well, interestingly, Klink saved some memorabilia about that. And I've been through this myself, so I know what things are like. Things, when a broadcast property is about to change hands, things get very touchy. First of all, because if somebody says the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person, this could stop the deal completely. It could blow a multi-million-dollar deal. Again, somebody's in bed with somebody else. It doesn't look good. The FCC says, no, we're not going to allow this transfer to take place. And also, invariably, when somebody buys a broadcast property, they bring their own people in, jobs are eliminated. So here's a memo that Klink saved from his boss, Clyde Hunt, reflecting some thoughts of the big boss of the station. And I'll read it to you. It's a little hard to read here, but I find it very interesting because of the hooks which this transfer was being effected through. He said, the necessity for members of the staff of the station to be most discreet in their relations with members of the staff of WIC is being pointed out. This is obviously a delicate situation, both factual and from a personal standpoint. WTOP Inc. has absolutely no authority in the present operation of WOIC, nor any plans as to what will be done, if any, and when if the sale is approved by the FCC. And of course, we wish to avoid any unnecessary unhappiness to any of those at WOIC. Would you please, therefore, refrain from visiting WOIC for the time being unless your visit is made necessary in connection with an actual TV broadcast from that station? Well, this is dated June 23rd. Here's another email from attorneys. 5 days later, apparently the sale did go through, so the gag order was off, and WTOP got its television station. And as Klink put it, as I was already chief engineer of WTOP AM and FM, the TV station to my responsibilities. Well, Klink writes again in some of his notes and ramblings. This is interesting, too, looking back at what broadcasting was like from an engineering side in the 1940s and 50s. He says, in the late 40s and 50s, the broadcasters generated the need for technical equipment and built some of it themselves until the manufacturers were able to catch up. The program people at first were not able to supply enough live programming and film to keep a television station on the air for more than a few hours a day. A typical schedule would be around a few hours in the late morning and early afternoon. I'm running out of time? Okay, well, let me push ahead. I'm sorry, I thought I had more time than that. Let me just finish this paragraph. The program people were at first not able to supply enough live programming and film to keep a station on the air for more than a few hours a day. A typical schedule would be a few hours in the late morning and early afternoon, then the station would sign off until the early evening. They were fortunate if there was enough material to stay on the air until 10:30 p.m. When we ran out of time, when the film ran out, we signed the station off. Well, he goes on and talks about problems with equipment, how finicky the transmitters were. The tubes, other components were really stressed to run at the frequencies and the power levels they're having to run at. He talks about transmitter going down. Sometimes they could fix it. Other times it didn't get fixed in time even to come back up and finish off the day's schedule. Other bits and pieces around the station. The certificate. He, like a lot of radio people, trained at RCA in Camden, become proficient in television. He saved his training certificate from RCA Camden. Here's a Vidicon paperweight. Somebody at Mashlet presented him. I wasn't even aware Mashlet was making Vidicons, but they gave Granny one when he was chief of the station. This is especially interesting to me. It's a program for RCA's fifth color television training situation there in Camden, dates March 29th, 30th. It's already their fifth, and of course color television is just a few months old of being legitimatized in December of 1953. List there, Klink saved this, he's in there. It's interesting, you've got Howard Chen, 4 or 5 others from CBS New York, you've got Stan Busby. Here's the RCA speakers, what they were going to be talking about. If you never knew, you know now, because Klink saved it. He also saved his building pass, which was supposed to be turned back in. Actually, this is from later in '54, so he was there more than once in color television's first year getting trained. Well, we're getting down to the good stuff here. I'm going to talk fast. I said the good stuff for last. Of course, as you know, CBS pushed through a color system which was not backwardly compatible with the existing monochrome system. There was a color war situation back in the late 40s, 50s, a shootout, and CBS won the first round, getting approval from the FCC to transmit color, 405 lines, 144 fields. Well, Klink was there and took some in the studio. CBS, again, owned the station. Even before they went television, they had set up a color studio in one of the radio studios there in the Earl Building, which is now the Warner Theater Building, in Washington, to demonstrate the system to FCC people, people on the Hill, others interested in color. So this is what he said about the and here's a letter, I think this was interesting too, from one of the attorneys for WTOP, the FCC that they were desiring to transmit some color programs on Monday, November 20th, 1950. Well, the FCC only approved CBS color in October of 1950, so this is really early in the game. This I found interesting too. It was a newspaper clipping. It's dated, if you can see the date there, January 31st, 1950, which tells me WTOP was transmitting color possibly through WOIC is very early on, even before the FCC said it was okay. They were doing it experimentally. People were building converters. They said there were 25 television sets for CBS color that existed at that time. One was in the Truman White House, 7 were in the homes of FCC commissioners, and the rest around, but a lot of people were building their own adapters. This is an engineer who worked with Klink. Klink probably built one of these too. They said there were 7 WTOP engineers who had built a color adapter for the CBS system. And also I found out that WTOP conducted a seminar. This is April 13th, 1951. This is before the Supreme Court decision, about a month and a half before the Supreme Court decision, which said the FCC did have the authority to impose a color standard. So they were very anxious, eager. It looked like they had the thing won. So CBS and TOP conducted a seminar for some 1,500 DC area TV repairmen and broadcast engineering technicians, demonstrating, it says here, color on a 17-inch color drum direct view receiver. Very well received, and this is the press release. color in a big way. Well, a little bit of a legend here on the pictures. This is what I think is worth the price of admission right here. These pictures. Thank you. Okay, this is what Klink said. These pictures below are of the CBS system as it was set up in the WTOP Earl Building Studios for demonstration to the FCC members and other interested people. And here we are. This is a radio studio which has been decked out for television. You see they've got, there's no heavy-duty air conditioning there. Of course, you couldn't use regular incandescent lights, so they've got banks of fluorescent lights. And you've got this rather strange-looking camera on a boom. This is the camera head itself. This is an operating control here. This is the operator and viewfinder here. Ed Wrightown helped me identify this. This was one of the, pardon me, SmithKline Finch surgical color cameras that CBS had used, and again, where they were using to telecast closed circuit some operations in color, or the early medical operations. Well, I went back to my collection, looked around, and sure enough, it's 10 feet 6, I believe. 10 inches from the contractor block is here. And I'm pretty sure that's what they were using there. It's also called the locomotive. So, one other picture, I got one more after this. The shading console for the camera. We said the color control console is all in Studio One control. A little fuzzy. This guy is walking inside, but it does give you an idea of what the shading console looked like when the CBS field camera. And one more picture, I couldn't resist this. Klink had several pictures of this color installation. He says one of the blonde lovelies used for the camera demonstration in the color system. Well, this is a picture of Klink in his last year or so. Talking a little louder too. We'll get this back to the next. Anyway, it's Charles Osgood with Granville Klink. This is Mr. Klink. I only met Granville Klink. His friends called him Granny in the last year of his life. He was in his 80s, 86, 87. Told me he was still working as a contractor for WTOP. He was still climbing towers and changing out light bulbs. Career was 60 years at the station. And apparently Osgood recognized that Klink had some special knowledge, special memories, and interviewed him for one of the shows. Well, I'm going to say one thing here, I'm going to wrap. I'm sure I get the names right here. I can't help but wonder if Granny Klink realized what he was leaving behind with his time capsule, with all these pictures and clippings and things that really don't exist anywhere else, like the RCA training program. The RCA came apart, I'm sure everything was either thrown away or swept out before it went. So this is probably the only copy of that in existence. So what they were training people, the topic areas they were discussing at this television, color television first year in the color. Well, as I said earlier, I only got to meet him once. I certainly wished I brought along a recorder and maybe a few hundred prepared questions, but I didn't. I didn't know the meeting was strictly a chance meeting. Which leads me to something else. Klink was one of many broadcast engineers who worked early in television. The number is diminishing very rapidly, as most stations employing his generation's engineering people on the air between 50 and 60 years ago, and not a lot of Granny Klinks left. This is home in a big way. A couple of years ago, I was researching when we got local color origination in my home television market of Shreveport. And I was able to hook up with one of the engineers who worked at CBS affiliate. They put in an RCA TK26. And I spoke with the person, and he remembered installing the change, but he could not come up with the date. He said, tell you what, I'll check with some of my buddies, people who retired from the station, and I'll get back to them. Well, he got back to me the same day, and he apologized. He said, I'm not going to be able to help you after all. After I got off the phone with you, I was getting ready to check with some of the other guys, and then I realized I was the last one of the bunch left. Well, there's a lot of television. Okay, keep going. There's a lot of television broadcasting history out there still. There's still a few Klinks, not many. And most people who lived it didn't save the way that Granville Klink did. I would admonish each and every one of you, and we're all interested in television's history, or we wouldn't be here. But when you get back to your hometowns, you've got a television station there, one of the older stations. Go to that station, try to get the names of some of the engineering people who were there at the start, or not long after. See if these people are still around. If you are, make an appointment with them. Get out there with a camcorder and a tripod and sit down and get them to talk about their career. You don't have to be a trained journalist or an interviewer to get these people talking. We need to capture what we can of this early broadcast history. I have a lot of stuff I didn't have time to read here about Clint's recollections of working in the television environment in the 40s and 50s. No matter how inconsequential or mundane it may seem to the people you're interviewing, what they have to contribute is important. Clint was interviewed by my friend James Snyder. He did an oral history. That's what I would ask you people to do. If you do get these oral histories, talk to me. I'll see about getting these into a library, a suitable place for them. Because this history really needs to be preserved. Get it down before it's lost forever. And before I leave, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John Weiser, who gave me my first tour of the WTOP, now WFTV transmitting facility, and introduced me to the scrapbooks. I'd also like to thank one of the engineers at the station now, Dave Colsar, who's allowed me access to the building scrapbooks on several subsequent occasions. That's all I have to say this afternoon, except for one thing. God bless you, Granny Klink, for being a Packer. Thank you.
James, that was very, very interesting and historical, but I will want to add one thing to it. In my town, a lot of GE executives, I'm going to get rid of this, GI executives retired too. And they were on the team with Jack Welch when GE destroyed RCA. And I was starting to develop the the restorations of CT100s and other RCA stuff. So I went after my guys and I said, hey, where did you put all the stuff from RCA? Oh, we trashed everything. Every warehouse, everything that had an RCA label went into the so-called dumpster or into the Hudson River or wherever. But there was nothing in the GE archives, and I had numerous people searching for me, left of RCA, except the National Broadcasting Company, which they're going to dump now to Comcast. So things have changed.
And here we have a training program and a building security pass that
Yeah.
Klink hung on to. He was supposed to surrender the pass when he left, but he didn't.
Yeah, so.
God bless him.
That happened. And so it's, well, I think what James is saying, you're all charged with protecting the history of what we're all involved in. Get it on paper, get it somehow. And whether it's to James or to the museum, we have to build an archive because this history is going to be lost forever. And let me just say one other thing. I'm getting a little older. You're all getting a little older. I'm on the board of a medical center. And what we're doing now is we're asking people to remember us in their wills if they've had good outcomes in care. Same thing with your TV sets. Get your lawyers and Steve will work with you. I'm going to donate most of my collection when I go because my kids want nothing to do with it. They want dollars. They want other things. They don't have the feeling for the TV sets. But between Steve and Kirk Stankiewicz and a couple of other people that I got close to, they'll help them dispose of the stuff and most of it will come here. So think about that. Don't worry about going to a flea market and selling a $25 set. If it's any good, give it to Steve, you'll get a tax deduction. So thanks, James. It's working again. Sorry for that. Before we start the next presentation, Steve told you that John Colson's going to come around to get some donations. Now, I know money is tight with everybody. Nobody has money left at the end of the month, at the end of the week. At the end of my sale, yeah. But quite frankly, Steve's been footing the bill for everything. You were all fairly generous in helping to get Hawkeye to here. Sorry, pal. You've all been generous in the past. The $30 entry fee to the convention is minimal, still costs Steve money. I'd like you to consider donating to the museum, send a check, give a check to Folsom. I'll start it off. I'll leave a check for Steve for $200 to the museum. We've got to build a war chest to continue what we're doing. Steve will give you an update when we get back about building the CRTs, but I want to keep the building going, I want to keep the equipment going, I want to keep the donations going. I've given a couple of minor things to the museum, some of you have given major things to the museum, but right now, I'd like you all to write a check for any amount. I don't care what it is. Be as generous as you can, because we've got to keep the museum going, and we can't rely on Steve to continue to take his weekly beer money and pay the rent. We've got to keep going. So thanks for your consideration. And what we're going to do now is we're going to get Lee. Hey, where are you, Lee? Come on up. You're not going to get away from us today. Lee Bartmakian is a Renaissance man. He's done everything in life, including fixing early electronics. So he's got the same disease as we all have. Lee, tell us about yourself while Daryl breaks the computer.
Thank you, Don. Well done. And you ought to be. Well, what about me? I was in the consumer electronics business for 27 years. I retired about 3 years ago. I was bought out of my corporation and told to leave. Gladly, I left. I do a lot of stuff, you know, now that I'm retired. You know, I scuba dive, I ride horses, I do a lot of stuff. But I'm into old stuff, you know. An old Rensselaer Polytech grad, huh? Got it. Thanks, Daryl. Gave me a TV, a 630 TS, about 4 years ago. And he says, you know, why don't you fix it up, you know? And I did. And he says, I guarantee you won't stop at one. I go, well, you know, one's enough. No, it wasn't. Never is. Everybody hear me okay? Alrighty, I'm going to take you through, you know, my restoration process on televisions. What's next first? Oh, hold on. Nothing. This is a Raytheon M1101. This is one in the museum. I got sort of a reputation around in my town for restoring TVs. An old lady, an 85-year-old lady, on Facebook no less, you know, dropped me a line, says, I have an old TV, maybe you'd like it, you know. And I get that a lot, you know. You know, a 1973 Mitsubishi TV is like some people's idea of an old TV. Right. I go, so what make is it? It's a Raytheon. I go, one ear went up. I go, well, what's it look like? It's got a round picture tube. I go, where do you live? She lives a mile away from me. So I went down there, and there it is, and I go, yeah, I'll take it. And she gave it to me. She said, you know, my nephew's going to turn it into an aquarium. I thought, that's not the right thing. I go, nice move, hon, thank you. Anyways, when I restore a set, the first thing I do is I break out the digital camera and I just take pictures. Pictures, pictures, pictures. Because you're going to tear the thing down to the ground. That's what I do. And unless you worked on the Raytheon assembly line, you're going to forget what you're doing. So take pictures, and when you take an assembly off a TV, bag it, put an index card right where the fasteners go to, and then put it on the assembly that you just disassembled, and just keep moving on. This set was in pretty good shape to start. I'm going to pick this up. It was all complete. It was unrestored. It didn't work, but I kept breaking it down. The chassis was pretty good. The CAD plating was pretty good. So what I did, you know, because usually there's animals and everything crawling over these damn things, and I don't need a case of dengue fever, you know, when I'm restoring these things. So I break them down. I take the pots, you know, take the transformers off it, and then I spray it in a solution called Spray 9. Everybody ever hear of Spray 9? It's good stuff. It'll eat the carbon right out of the CAD plating, but leave the CAD plating alone. It also has an emulsifying agent in it, and it just takes all the gook off, like underneath, you know, the caps and everything like that. Then you know, rinse it in hot water, blow dry it, and then you put it in your oven at 125 degrees Fahrenheit for about 3 or 4 hours. Obviously, I'm not married. This was a nice chassis. It was pretty good. The high voltage section, obviously. I ended up cleaning off that flyback with, you know, the wax, and I bought some beeswax, and I filled it in with an eyedropper full of hot beeswax and fixed that later. But again, this is all the initial stage where I just take pictures, 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 because I want to put it right back to what it used to be. That's the cabinet. The cabinet, the finish was okay. It was checked, but good old Howard's. Just put some Howard's Restore finish on there. I left it on there for about a day and let it just sit there. And then I just took at it with some 5.0, 4.0 steel wool, went with the grain. Careful around the edges because you'll take the finish right off. And just work very, very slowly, very methodically, and you'll bring it back. And then, let's see. Yeah, that's another shot. Obviously, I took the whole thing apart, right? You know, take the screens off and everything, you know. There's a chassis. I think that's a chassis after I cleaned it. It looks pretty good. Yeah. I restuffed the cans. And here's another shot of the cabinet. Yeah, again, before I take anything off, I always take lots and lots of pictures. Got it going. This is just before I'm going to load it into the cabinet. There's the finished chassis. And as you see, it came out pretty good. Yeah, it's, well, when I get through them, I want to, you know, be able to eat off every surface of the damn thing. Yeah. Ain't it pretty? Yeah, it was a nice set. There's a test pattern of it. And I don't know if you can see it, but no, you really can't see in this picture. But when I set them up in a test pattern, what I do is I draw the mask inside the CRT before I put it into the cabinet, and then I get the center lines, and I put a center line, you know, in a Sharpie, and then I set the test pattern up, and then I adjust the linearity and everything like that. I want to get it as perfect as I can, you know, when it's warmed up. Aim small, miss small. So when you load it back in the cabinet, you know, as far as final tweaks are concerned, you're pretty close. There it is going in. By the way, the inside of the cabinets I also do. Basically, you know, because these things are typically moldy, just wipe the inside with, you know, some mineral spirits soaked in an old terry towel, and just wipe with the grain. And then, you know, if the finish is still okay, leave it alone. If not, just get some mid-wax, either walnut or mahogany stain, and just restain the interior. Give it a nice, neat home for it to reside in, you know. I like pretty things. There it goes. Boom. And I think that's Peter Lorre. You can just barely see him right there. And it's done. Yeah. And it's the devil's in the details, you know. I detail them right down to the knobs, everything. There's Bogey. And boom. Actually, I think I hit the top finish with a little bit of tung oil. Just one layer. Just let it sit there, and then I think I did another one. Isn't that pretty? See the outside of that dial on the left? All that was, you know, like the edges always crumbles away. I had to build up the back of it with epoxy. And then I blended it in with the rest of it, and then I took my girlfriend's nail polish, which was the right color, and it worked. Yep. Like say, look at that flip-down lid. See how pretty that is? That's a motorized toothbrush and some toothpaste. I just went all over in there and just knocked out all the oxidation right off it. Boom. Oh, that's Raging Bull. I need to, okay, where am I next? Okay, 721 TCS. This is what I'm working on right now. I got this one in the Bronx for $50. It was sitting in a garage for probably about 40 years, in an unheated garage, which means this thing probably endured temperature swings of like 5 degrees below zero to 120 degrees in the summer. But when I took the chassis out, I put it on the bench. I just had to see whether it was working, and the thing still had high voltage. The thing still worked. Well, I'll fix that. After I recapped it, it didn't work. This thing looked like it had been attacked by the Luftwaffe. You know, it was that poor thing. You know, but you know, and I had a case of buyer's remorse. I only paid $50 for it, but I go, I'm going to save this one. So again, pictures, pictures, pictures. What a mess. See those gouges? I'll show you how to get rid of those. Yeah, big speaker. I took the CRT in, tested it. Boom, there it is. I woke it right up. That's nice. There's the chassis. But you see my 2 little fingerprints right there? Where's my laser pen here? Yeah, there's nice CAD plating underneath it. So, let's clean it up. Let's take more pictures. Always take pictures of the bottom. All localized areas before I start recapping it. Your digital camera is going to be your best buddy when you do it. Oh, here I am stripping the cabinet. Citrus strip. Anybody use it? It's good stuff. You know, just put a layer on there and let it sit for about at least an hour. And, you know, let it sit. Oh, that's a picture of the front. I had to obviously strip all that off. When you're going to take decals off, take pictures of everything you're going to strip off, because when you got to replace it, you got to put it right back where it was before. There it is stripped. Now, it looks pretty good, but there's still a lot of dents in there, okay? Because this thing was, you know, getting beat on. So what do? Terry towel, moistened with water, wrung out. Put the towel on the top, get your household iron, and iron the wood. All the divots, all the scratches and gouges, get all leveled again. Now, you're not ready for stain yet. Okay, there's the I'm back to the chassis. What a mess. There's a speaker. Oh, see, I just took the thing out in the garage and I blew dry it, you know, with a compressed air in the garage. And there's all that nice pretty CAD plating coming right through. So this one was in pretty good shape. Isn't that nice? I think that's what it's running, yeah. All right, here we go, back to the cabinet. There I am with a jitter sander, and I think I'm probably using, well, I'm trying to get off some of the residue, so I'm probably using like 220. Stay away from the edges when you're like this, because you can burn right through, you know, veneer very fast, especially RCA cabinets. They're not very thick. But, you know, again, 90% of finishing anything is preparation. So just keep making passes. So make sure you try to rinse as much of that citrus strip out of there before you refinish it, because you'll get fish eyes in the finish when you start refinishing. Very meticulous. See the dark spots in the wood? That's like residual strip and finish. You got to take all that out. And there it is down to virgin wood. I started staining on the inside leg to see what it looks like, and it looks pretty good. There's one pass. And you can see it really pops. You know, I've restored a lot of cabinets, but, you know, nothing is really pleasing to the eyes when these things start popping again. You know, like they're on the comeback trail. And that's just a stain. That's using Midwax red mahogany stain. That's just sitting on there. And you wipe it off, you know, depending on dark you want it to be. That's just stain, no finish. But it's coming back. Boom, boom. There it is. There's a shot, I think, with first pass of something called Varathane, an oil finish. It's not a lacquer. I didn't use lacquer this time. It's nice stuff. You can put it on with a brush. You can wipe it clean with a paper towel, and it just sets up really nice. I've got about 6 or 7 coats on it now, and it is beautiful stuff, you know, sanding in between, and it's very hard. It's very easy to use. And you don't have a spray booth. It's pretty hard to spray a large cabinet like that with a shake, you know, a rattle can. So use other stuff. Yeah. The frame. The frame was a project in itself. You know, it was all beat up, and it had like that fake, you know, vinyl wood finish on the inside. Yeah, whatever it is. Yeah, photo finish. So obviously I couldn't duplicate that, and I couldn't save it, so I stripped it off. And I got some some real mahogany veneer and I laid it edgewise like the original. And I put mahogany veneer on the outside part of the frame because that was all gouged and beat up too. Here I am paste wood filling it and staining it. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some wood finish and I'm going to put it through one of my hobby guns, little spray guns, and I'm going to fake the fake wood finish back on that using a spray gun. And then I'll seal it up. I guarantee you when it'll be done, it'll look good. Yeah. It's a lot prettier than it used to look, I can tell you that much. Okay, lytics. I stuff cans. I want these things to look like they were, right back to the factory, when I get through with them. I buy my lytics from Mauser Electronics. They got these really nice Nichicon and Panasonic 105 degrees centigrade cans. They're tall, they're thin, they're narrow, and they fit, And I just learned, I think it was Henry Canoria just told me that Mauser has a whole new series of these lytics coming out now that are wicked tall, very thin. I mean, they're like 10 millimeters, in diameter and maybe 40 millimeters tall, and they're like 450 volt rated. And those things will fit under anything. So I guess those are coming out in about a month or so. I'll be using those. Yeah, I like to put a little hot glue in between them because I figured if they vibrate or something like that, you might hear them. You see them? No, you don't. I restuff all the tubulars too. Now, some people use wax, some people use hot glue. I use both because hot glue, I think, has a higher melting temperature. So what I do is I'll put the, put the new cap inside the paper, the tube there, and then I'll fill it with hot glue, and then I'll dip it in wax, like a dark amber color. It looks like it came from the factory, but it won't melt, when it heats up. Yep. Okay, now I'm doing I just finished a 721 TS, its little tabletop brother. This one was not as in-depth a restoration. The thing worked, but I recapped it anyways. I had to redo the frame, redo the cabinet because it was veneer missing and it was all gouged up. This I used Mohawk lacquer on this one, and because the front panel was in good shape, I had to match all the other woods to it. So I figure a satin spray Mohawk was the way to go. That's the top of my oven at home, with the nice 1000 CFM blower vent above it. That's my spray booth, the kitchen. Yeah. No, I never will be either. That's the cabinet. That bounced back pretty good. There's probably 3 or 4 more coats of Mohawk before I finished it. There's the inside, all cleaned up. And I break them all down. You see all the mounting hardware and all that stuff? I clean all that, and I just hit it with just a slight dusting of aluminum taint. Looks like it's for all freshly anodized again. I save all the factory markings on the inside whenever I can. All these stamps and stuff like that. That's the front refinish, and you say it all matches up pretty good. Even stuff like that, that little that brass clasp, that's an hour's work. Wet sanding it with 220 to try to get the right, finish and sheen and make it look good. These miserable slat speaker panel there, I didn't have to refinish that, thank God, and add all the decals, so that was no big deal. There's the inside. I like laying 2 strips of cardboard there when I slide the cabinet in. There it goes. Boom. And there I am, my aim small, miss small, philosophy on setting them up. There I am centering the CRT. Boom. Is it lit up? Okay. There's the 721 TS chassis, service manual online there. And it looks pretty good. It's dialed in pretty straight. Yeah, this one works pretty good. Sounds good too. this was the one that when I recapped, it didn't work. So, no, I'm sorry, that's the TCS. This one works fine. I didn't screw this one up. That's about as straight as I can get it. It's good linearity, and it's dead center. Ba-boom. Dawn Patrol. Well, these things are time machines to me, That's why I like watching old stuff on them. There's my collection at night. And there it is at day. Oh, yeah, this is 721 finish. This thing came out nice. Isn't that pretty? Yeah. You see, that was a whole bunch, that was a lot of pieces of missing veneer in there. I had to match them all up. You can barely see them, but it's done. Yeah. And I think that's about it. Am I not finished yet?
I'll tell you why.
Why?
Because when you come back next year,
Yeah?
you're going to finish the photo finish cabinets and how to get the original grain that was laid on photographically.
I am? What are you, nuts?
A little bit. Homework.
Oh, there's George. Say hi, boys. All right, well, thank you. Thank you all for your time, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. It's interesting. The collectors do restoration. I'm a Class Z amateur restorer, but I do a little bit of that stuff. And it's interesting how you can save your money and still come out with a beautiful finished product, as Lee has done, putting his toil, sweat, tears, and everything else into the refinishing. Steve, our benefactor, was the original chassis stripper. When I first met him years ago, he was drilling out each socket and each can, dropping them below the chassis, and coming up with a naked piece of steel which he would refinish, and then he would reassemble the chassis and make it work. And I'll tell you, when I saw that, I kept saying, what's wrong with that guy? But it paid off with the beautiful work he did do. And I think blindfolded, he was able to reconstruct the harness underneath and rewire everything with his stuffed resistors and stuffed cans and everything else. That is another trip in itself. And Lee, all kidding aside, if you can bring back next year a couple of cans and small caps and things that you've stuffed, lay them out on the table, and just walk us through how you did everything with a couple of before and afters. Because there are a lot of collectors that want to get purity in their restoration. Me, I just want to see a picture when I'm finished. I'm not that fussy, but God bless you for doing that. So we're going to go ahead with our last presentation before the break. And it's an interesting one that Wayne Hebert figured out on how to bypass the tuner section and put audio and video sets, because let's face it, on all the sets I've worked on, the tuners are lousy and they're very difficult to get working again correctly. You got to go through all sorts of alignments and whatever. But when Kirk Stankiewicz was helping me Sylvania 451, the tuner was really lousy, but the rest of the set was good. So he put a direct audio and a direct video feed into the chassis, and I found an old 10-year-old Radio Shack video amplifier that they use for driving long analog video lines. I put it in, and I was able to get the video, so I got a perfect picture. So Wayne's going to tell you his method. Go right ahead, boss.
Okay, thank you. A little bit. I started out when I was in high school in the 60s, working at a TV shop, and that's where I caught the bug apparently. And I didn't understand what I was fixing, but the guy was teaching me. Then I went on to get a couple degrees in electrical engineering, and ended up working in the aerospace industry for 40 years. But I'm still an avid collector and enjoy finding those rare sets. My talk today is, as was well introduced, is about converting, and I'll just jump into it, but I'm trying to bypass you ever had a set that the tuner or the IFs will just not tune, or the tuner is damaged, and it frustrates you, yet you still want to keep the set and use the set. Well, this is a transistor circuit where you can do that, and you can bypass the tuner and the IF stages. And there's one will be shown for black and white sets, and one that Pete developed for color for CT100s. And the two, like I said, the first one's a transistor, and then Pete has adapted an RCA circuit that was published years ago. And I'll do my best to present that information. Pete may have to jump in and help me. Now, talk about the black and white first. And I recently found an Admiral, actually found in a closet in Melbourne Beach, Florida. God knows how many years it was there, but it has split sound, where the sound is, instead of the video, modern sets, the sound and video go through all the common IF stage. Well, sound is taken off early. And for the love of me, everything seemed to be working properly. The IFs were conductive and the biases were all right. I couldn't get this, and some of you have probably had that frustration of not being able to get sound through. That's common. The 621 is one that really drives you crazy. But anyhow, the tuner had severe cross modulation or modulation problems. And I looked at the bulletin, the SAMs, and it talked about rewiring this and rewiring. It seemed like quite a job. So I thought, well, this is a good time for me to develop this video amplifier and inject it into the video, bypass all that, inject it into the video amplifier. And I used, you can go get modern ICs and do this probably better and simpler, but I'm old-fashioned. I like, get a 2222 and 2222 and a 2907. They're 60-volt parts. The gain bandwidth product is 200 or 300 megahertz. If you put a little extra voltage on them, they don't get their feelings hurt like ICs do. They're good, rugged parts. And you can easily rectify a filament, the 6-volt filament or 12-volt filament in your set, and use that to power these. Once you do that, then what you've got coming out of your set is you bring some coax cables out so you can feed it. You can take a DVD player and take the video and audio out of the DVD player and put it in. And the audio, you just pop it into the first AF amplifier, and it works fine. That part's easy. So a little background. If you look at there's a composite video signal. On the left is a bright scene with a lot of white in it. And that dotted line is the average. That's the DC average of that signal. On the right, you see a dark scene, and the DC component is a lot lower. And if it's hard for you to imagine that, just imagine flipping the one on the right upside down and imagine it being made out of ice and it just all melted. It would come to that level. It's the DC component of it. Okay, and the pedestal level, as is shown there, is set at. That's the level where your set goes black, by the way. That's the signal it takes to drive it from bright to just cut off. And they set that composite video, that's set at the 75% level. Then the sync they set the sync at the 100% level. And if you got a VCR, which nobody uses anymore, but your DVD player, that NTSC signal is about 1.5 to 2 volts peak to peak. And if you tried to drive your black and white sets, your video amplifier input with that is not enough. You need 6, 7, 8, 10 volts, depending on the set. And so you need an amplifier. And if you had a DC amplifier, everything would be fine, but so many amplifiers are coupled that once you do that, you lose that DC component. So you have to restore it, and they call that a DC restorer. And there's a DC restorer, and of course, the old tubes they didn't use a modern diode. They used a 6AL5 or something as a diode. But all you're doing is you're rectifying that signal. You're saving the peak voltage in the capacitor, so it'll move it. A positive DC restorer, moves it up, and a negative DC restorer, I'll show you in a second, moves it down. And you should have a time constant of almost a 1/10 of a second. And as I say here, many of the early sets did not have DC restorers in their design. There is just the negative version of that. I took this schematic from, an early black and white set, and I wanted to show you you look at the time constant, it's about a 1/10 of a second, I mentioned. And it's also worth noting that they've got a resistor in series with the diode. And I'll show you, that was even important in this transistor amplifier. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, this isn't the actual circuit I used, but I came up with 2 versions of this. This one has a capacity to give you 12 volt peak to peak. You don't need that on many sets, but this one will give you 12 volts. So if you take the 6 volt filament and you put a doubler in there, you charge the cap up on one cycle and throw 2V at the cap on the next cycle, you get about 16 volts DC. You got a couple of volts to bias the 2907 emitter, and then a volt for the transistor to be active. So when you're done, you've got about 12 volts left. And it's a simple, if you look at the front where the NTSC comes in, I've got a potentiometer, and I just use the small ones where you just put a little screwdriver on the side. But you can throw away as much, you can put the full signal in, or you can attenuate it down to nothing. So you can adjust how much signal is coming in with that potentiometer. You look at the first stage, the gain of these stages, by the way, is basically the ratio of the load resistor divided by the emitter resistor. You see the 2,000 divided by roughly 500, that's got a gain of 4. The second stage has got a gain of 3. See, 300 divided by 100. And it has a decent bandwidth. This one didn't go quite to 5 megahertz. 3 dB, it went to 4 megahertz. You see across the 2K resistor. Yeah, where's it? Okay, sorry. No, I'm just trying to figure out how to put it on. There's a button here somewhere. Oh, there is. Okay. And actually, that capacitor's in the wrong place. I apologize. It's in the right place in the circuit. It's the wrong place in this drawing. What you do is, like I say, you got a gain of 4 here, and you got a gain of 3 here. What you do is you put a capacitor across this emitter. If what it's doing in effect is making this resistor smaller, so it punches this gain up at high frequency to compensate for the roll-off. And that's just what it does. Now I've got coupling capacitors You want to make sure you've got about 1/10 of a second, 2 microfarads, and remember, this resistor comes back multiplied by beta is what the impedance looks like. So 2 microfarad works great there. 1 microfarad works great here. I got a 100K load resistor. There's a DC restorer. And why did I put 1,000 ohm in series with it? I'll show you. Without it, there's some distortion. So there it is. I mean, that's a pretty simple circuit, except for the mistake I made there. Okay, here's the one I used in the Admiral set. I only needed 6 volts peak to peak, so I didn't need the doubler. Got like 7.5 volts here. I'm wasting about 1.5 volts here, so I can get 6 volts peak to peak. Same thing, attenuate the signal. Coupling capacitor. Boy, I got that resistor in the wrong place. I mean, capacitor in the wrong place there too, sorry. That should be over here. Anyway, I've got quite a bit of gain here, more than I need. You see I've got a gain of 6 here and a gain of 6 here. And I end up throwing a lot of it away. But this one had nice 3 dB gain of 30 to 5 megahertz. I ended up not using a DC restorer in the circuit, which you could argue why didn't I, but it didn't seem to make much difference. But anyway, I've got adequate coupling capacitors here. And you want to be down, you want to go good down to 30 hertz. And it's funny because I hooked this up to the TV and I was playing with the coupling capacitor and kept making it smaller and smaller. And the interesting thing, before the picture got really poor quality, I lost vertical sync. So vertical sync seems to be the most important factor here. Okay, next. Now this is the schematic of the Admiral I put the video amplifier into. And the neat thing, you can pull the RF and all the IF stages. You even pull this final detector. Just pull the tubes. You know, there's an argument that the AGC goes crazy, but if you're pulling all the tubes, it probably doesn't matter. And there was a 4700 ohm. I made that 100K, so I could get away with a smaller coupling capacitor. So my the output of my video amplifier went right there. I probably should have shown this earlier. This is an output of a normal. This is a Dazzle where you can take pictures from your camera and put it in this, and it will give you a NTS signal out, which is kind of neat. But you can see 0.5 volt per. The actual signal is only less than 2 volts. This is from a DVD player. There's the color burst, and again, it's only a couple volt amplitude, and you need more than that. Now, here's the output of that first circuit I showed you, the one running off 17 volts. And look at that. I've got a sine wave, but 2 volts per, that's a 12 volt peak to peak signal. And see how nice it is? So you want to, there's an adjustment. I didn't show earlier. Let's see, I'll go back real quick. Yeah, you want to adjust this, make that a variable resistor, and set that point at 6 volts right there. Yeah. Now look at it. I increased the signal a little more, and what you want to see is it saturate on both sides at the same time. You're right in a sweet spot, right in the middle. That's the best you can do right there. Now, this is the output of the amplifier without the DC restorer. Of course, it's AC coupled, so that the DC component is 0. This is with a negative DC restorer. That diode I showed you, I just added the diode. Notice this distortion. Okay, here's a positive DC restorer. And again, you can see the distortion. This is ground. Now, by adding the 1K ohm resistor, it looks pretty clean. Surprising, that's all it took. And this is the positive DC restore. Now, the reason ground, it isn't, if you had a perfect diode, but silicon diodes have a 0.7 volt offset voltage. So that's what you're seeing there. You don't get that with a tube. There's no offset voltage in a tube diode. Okay, this is the results, and some of this source material may not be as high bandwidth as my amplifier. Old Jag Benny. And there's the Indian head pattern. I couldn't get the horizontal linearity quite as good as I wanted. Okay, then we're done with that portion of it. David Karlstrom, I don't know if he's here in the audience or not. There he is. Okay, good. So keep me honest, Dave. He emailed Steve and wanted me to make mention of what he has done. He has developed 2 transistor circuits for 2 different Heathkits. One of these is a tube Heathkit set and one's a transistor set. And he's feeding them S-Video. The advantages of S-Video is that your black and white, there's 2 separate wires that carries the black and white and the color, the chroma information. And this interface is free of the cross, modulation of those 2 signals. And his circuits, he has a switch so that you put this in the set, you can switch back and forth from what you had originally to the S-Video input. And as he mentions that the tube set is not uncommon to RCA design, so this could be used in an RCA tube set. And this is where Dave, if you go to that on those points on the internet, you can see Dave's circuit in much more detail. Okay, now I'm switching gears to color CT100s and Pete's effort. Now Pete developed, he'll show you here, or he did it. He developed the first circuit that had to be pretty intimate with the chassis and go in there and add a relay and add, solder some things in. And his second design is pretty much a plug and play. But you'll see both of them here. And as Pete's pointed out, when FCC adopted the color, the NTSC standard, a lot of stations were scrambling to convert over, and what are we going to use for monitors? And a lot of companies started building these monitors, and of course, the 15G GP22 was the tube that was available first. And then, of course, in '54, the CT100 was available, the Merlin that we all love. And this slide indicates that looks like more of these were given away than were sold. But when RCA quickly developed a 21-inch, within 6 months of the introduction of the CT100. But a lot of these were built and put in celebrities or executives' homes, and I don't know how many were sold privately, but we'll probably never know. And in terms of color monitors, it was just, it was a natural thing to look at a CT100, and if they were scrapped especially, why not convert these to be the monitors we need in some of the, you know. If you're looking for a monitor, if you're in a studio, you don't need RF, you just want to be able to feed it the video. And so a lot of these were adapted. And as Pete's pointing out, there were a lot of these available. They were a great set. And I didn't know this until this presentation, but apparently the Westinghouse had superior high voltage regulation. And anybody who's owned a CT100 knows the scenes change, the high voltage comes and goes. But the CT100 had, according to Pete, and I agree with him, it has the best color processing. It looks like it gives the CBS about the same grade for color processing. So these were the sets that were modified. And I think I just said that. The CTC2 is the CT100 chassis. And the place to inject that is the first video amplifier, the 6CL6. Just like I did in the black and white set. I went into that. Well, there's not a first, there's only one video amplifier in that set. And Pete's making the same argument I'm making, that you need more than your DVD player is going to give you. You need an amplifier. He's saying you need about 6 volts, and you got 1 to 2, so. Before the CT100 was built, we've heard Ed Rutan and your presentations talking about the famous, the Rose Bowl parade. RCA made up handmade 200 sets, sprinkled around the United States, and showed the Rose Bowl parade in major hotels and other places around the country. Televised that in color. And the Model 5 those were the sets those 200 prototypes. And he's saying that the B570 was modified to accept composite video. And this set was owned by an executive, as we know. And then some of that circuitry was stripped out. Now it's interesting, I actually own this set. I actually bought it here at one of the meets in the parking lot. But so I took a picture in the back of my set. You see the B570. And there's an old, I call them VHF connector, but there's a connector that video would have come in on. Now in '56, there was an article by RCA in Broadcast News that showed, was it Pete, 3 circuits where you could inject video into your CT100. And Pete selected the first one. He liked the simple, 12AT7 with two stages. And it had a DC restorer. There's a copy of the article. And here's a close-up of that first circuit that Pete chose. It required high voltage and required a bias voltage of minus 30 volts. And there's the 2 stages of the 12AT7. He points out that one of these sold today, I said that in 6 months they came out with a 21-inch, well, that's the CT55, and that required a lower voltage. Now his first monitor, he scabbed onto the back of the set. Oh, this is a high voltage cage, I'm sorry, yeah. And he put the BNC and the RCA inputs. He had to get filament voltage B plus, negative bias, and he's got a relay, which I'll show you in a second. This is underneath, and the relay is right there. So you had to get a little more intimate with your set if you use this, his first generation. He said this circuit had good high frequency response, and which you'd expect out of these tubes. I mean, these tubes can go up, and the gain's not that high in this. And to get the higher frequency response, you know, just like I was using a capacitor to lower the emitter resistor, which in this case would be the cathode resistor. They use a peaking coil, which increases the resistance. You get the same effect. You get more gain that way. So at high frequency, that compensates and gives you a flat response. And this is where, you know, engineers, once you do something you're not happy and you want to do something better. So he said, why don't I make one that would be almost plug and play? And he did. He made 6 of them, actually. So he got some 9-pin socket savers on eBay and wired them up. And then he put, so you would pop out your 6CL6, plug this in, and then put the tube in top of that. So that would be plugged right into your chassis. And then this could take the filament voltage. It can get at everything except B+. And he cleverly found a place to get B+ on an above chassis location near the contrast pot. So you didn't have to pull the chassis. Pulling the chassis out of a CT100, those are heavy, a lot of bolts. So that was a good idea. And here is one installed. You can see he's got, I guess that's where is that where the tube's plugged in? I should know that, but I don't. And he's doing a sweep here. I can't defend how he's doing this, but it looks pretty flat out to 5 megahertz. Just a little bit of roll off. That's just another rendition of it, really. Okay, he put 30 hertz, and again, that's supposedly an order of magnitude below the lowest frequency component of the video signal. And he shows input, you know, what a square wave. Of course, out of this generator, it's completely squared. You can see it rolling. You can see the RC time constant. You see it tailing off. He shows the first and second stage. And he's not too happy with that. So he went back, like we all do, go back to the book where you learn everything, the Grubb Basic Television. And again, it said you want to be 10 times better than the lowest video signal. So you want 30 hertz coupling at the low end. And he's saying it's not just, you just can't increase the capacitor. You know, there's limitations on the tube as well for resistance. So he went from 10 to 20 mics and saw an improvement in the 30 hertz square waves. But then when he additionally lowered the value of the grid resistors, then things even got better. So he went from 100 megohms down to these values, and then, like I say, he doubled the coupling capacitors. And he built a doubler off the filament voltage, like I'd done earlier, to create this bias voltage. The reason for the bias voltage is every receiver usually needs some bias unique to that set, in addition to the signal, the video signal. Excuse me. And here's a close-up of his circuit. You see the doubler here. You see the 2 stages here. And this just is another input and output, which is pretty square. And actually the slope of this is the RC time constant. There were his 6 units, the boxes, and there's you had quite a production line going here. Here's the 6 units he built. And he scattered these around. I think Folsom ended up with, I don't know who else ended up with these, but he scattered them around to his friends. And the results are excellent.
Which is the picture of Pete?
I don't think it's that one. Let's see, I don't need that. That's the backup. Okay, Pete. All right, thank you. It's funny how you, many times we reviewed this, how you can't see it until it's up here. Okay, any questions or? Well, I was going to have that for backup, but I did hit it. Jerome, I guess the early one that Pete built, if you look at the SAMs tells you how the filament is wired, and the actual set it's wired the other way around, which one is hot and which one is ground. And when they first tried this, they were blowing fuses. So I think Jerome is the one that, right, Jerome, that pointed that out to Pete, or Pete, I forget who pointed out. The service literature, okay. That's right. Okay, thank you, John. Anyhow, any other questions?
Is this schematic information on the website?
Yeah, that's a good point. We ought to send, well, if we send them to Steve, or maybe he could put them on his website. We'll make them available. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Wayne. We all learned something. A lot of hard engineering went into this, but just let me give you a little vignette. 10 years ago, I was experimenting with analog high-definition television. Took a Sony data-grade projector, high resolution, only fed by RGB analog video. I got an Ikegami scan converter, which took NTSC and gave RGB output, and it produced 1050i. Put it in the projector, big screen, 150-pound projector, turned it on, and we had a dim picture because the 7-inch CRTs that put the output luminance wasn't strong enough. There were only 7-inch CRTs. So I found an Extron box that mated computers to the RGB input, and it had a variable video gain pot on it. When we put that in and we drove the video way above 1-to-1, peak to peak, 1 volt, picture was gorgeous. It produced great brightness, but we had to consider at that point sacrificing the CRTs with a short shelf life compared to taking everything down, moving the screen, moving the projector, and getting a small picture. But the system worked great, and it is still working today, using it occasionally by overdriving, and that came by changing the voltage on the video input. So I would like Brother Darrell to start building black boxes for available for sale at next year's convention that help us with a black and white version, a color version, a CT100 version, and whatever else these geniuses have devised, and make it plug and play. And I thank you all. Well, we're going to take a little bit of a break now. Pit stops are available, but Brother Folsom is going to start collecting money to put the arm on you, but you all do good things here, and so help Steve keep the museum going. Thanks very much. See you in about 20, 30 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Nowadays.
Your attention for one moment. Steve just reminded me of something. I'm making a pitch for some money. Steve has a matching grant of $1,080 in honor of Dave Johnson. If we can collect that much money from the 100-some-odd people here today, Steve will be able to come up with over $2,000 to the museum. It's a matching grant from an anonymous donor who knew Dave and knew the museum. We've got to collect $1,080, and Steve gets the money. So please dig deep. I appreciate it.
you next?
You got a web browser on that thing?
Yes. Well, let me get there, and hopefully we've got some kind of wireless. If we might need a password for whatever this,
No, I
this
don't need to
facility
go to
is.
the web.
Oh, you just want a web browser? Oh, okay. Yep. Yeah. Switch, so we don't need to. Is there
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, the second act is about to begin. Please take your seats. No talking, no smoking. I have bad news and I have good news. The bad news is you're going to hear more lectures. The good news is that you generous characters donated $1,650. When you add that to Steve's 1,080, 2,700 and change goes to the ETF, so Steve doesn't have to work washing dishes in the restaurant down the road. Come on up. We're going to start our afternoon presentations. If you're not in your seats, you're going to be escorted out. Close the beer off in the back. Oh, wow. Gary Davis is here. He's sitting down. He requested that you don't throw rotten apples at him during his presentation. 60th anniversary of RCA NBC's famous walkie-talkie, or Creepy Pete backpack camera transmitter, which was a landmark, and I guess you'll learn all about how the reporters were able to walk around strapped into electronic equipment and do their presentations from the field, from the conventions, from wherever else they had to be. Gary, come on up. Will you break up the game in the back of the room, somebody?
Thank you, Don. I'll try to just hold it so I like to hear myself. That's great. Okay, thank you. Is there anything else? Okay. I was an 11-year-old boy when I first saw an RCA walkie-lookie work on live TV. First program in my life, something I've seen in person, so bear with me. The RCA, or walkie-lookie, was really dreamed up by RCA's David Sarnoff. David Sarnoff was demonstrating airborne television on March 21st, 1946, in Anacostia, District of Columbia, at the air station, and he mentioned the term that it walkie-lookie, and he dreamed of a backpack television camera so small that it could be handled by one man. And it took a few years for the top engineers and developers at RCA to come up with the design. But 60 years ago, right now, 60 years ago, in 1951, RCA had under development by some of the top designers in the United States this fantastic project. And we'll kind of touch on some of those things today. The RCA camera, if you see, it's a Vidicon camera, and on the backpack transmitter, there were several built, several prototypes. And this one, particular one that we see up here, and the next one coming up will be what I think was the final development, but there were several of them built. This is one of the most famous pictures and one of the few color pictures available of the camera itself. And you'll see that it's a Vidicon camera he's holding, and up in the top is a 1-inch viewfinder tube. It has a lens turret with 3 lenses. The camera weighs 8 pounds. On his back is a 45-pound backpack transmitter, and it's a UHF transmitter and also a VHF receiver. And this particular photograph does not show a back brace, but it was so heavy that after running this thing for a couple hours, it would break your back. It certainly wouldn't mine. And there was a back brace that was used. It required almost constant attention, and we'll mention why. And you'll see that the backpack is open in the insert, and you'll see someone working with some adjustments on the miniature circuitry for that particular era. Okay, this photograph was, or camera in this photograph was the one that was used on August 11th of 1954 for an NBC telecast from Fort Meade, Maryland. This was the first time that it was really hit very heavily on the networks in this live broadcast in August. Prior to that, it was used at the 1952 political conventions in Chicago. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party had their convention at the Chicago Amphitheater. And the reason that they had the conventions in the same city is because the television networks would only have to set up once and not move to a different city with the technology that existed. So it was used in 1952. I did not see the 52 broadcast. The Davis family could not afford a television set in 1952, but I did have one by 54. So essentially this is what the unit consisted of and the best picture available. The next picture coming up is a photograph of the article that's going to be my reference. And I must explain that I was a lieutenant at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1970. And I was allowed to use the electronics library at Fort Sill as much as I wanted to, whatever I wanted to do on my own time, but I could not take anything out of the building, out of the room. So what I did was I memorized, went back into these old electronics magazines from the 50s and was able to get the date and the issue number. And then when I was released from Fort Sill, I went back to Columbus, Indiana, and had the Indiana State Library provide photographs that I have today are reproductions of not only this article, but by many of the basic articles on Vidicon cameras. And so that's why you see a kind of a poor picture, because this copy is about 40 years old. And I didn't have any control over how the quality of the copying machine at that particular time. They would not let me take the issue out of the Indiana State Library, but they did make photocopies for me. So I apologize for the poor quality of the picture. You can see the cameraman up in the top picture, and the camera's a little washed out, and you can make out the transmitter pack, and at the bottom is the Vidicon camera itself. Okay? This camera was used not only on the military television show on August 11th of '54, but it was also the subject of one of the U.S. Army Big Picture productions. If you remember the show, The Big Picture, about the U.S. Army in the 50s, because before videotape, all the television stations in the country, as you well know, they accepted all kinds of films. And so the U.S. Army had this whole series on selling you on the U.S. Army, and one of the programs was devoted to this particular camera. It was also used on the Dave Garroway show in a show called Wide Wide World. It was on Sunday afternoon and live. I also saw that show, and I was amazed that this camera was on a ski lift out in Colorado, and it was headed down a ski lift, and you could see the ground coming up, and that was just something to see a live picture from a ski lift in Colorado on a Sunday afternoon in Indiana. This work and this development was the forerunner of all of today's minicams. Everything that you had to do in 1952, you have to do today, and of course it's more advanced. These pictures coming up are going to be taken from, most of them taken from, the January 1952 issue of Electrical Engineering, which named this camera the Outstanding Development of 1951. The actual pictures you're going to see this morning, or this afternoon I should say, is taken from the June 1952 issue of Electronics magazine, timed just prior to its use at the political conventions in 1952. Okay, this is a Vidicon camera tube. For those of you that aren't familiar with Vidicons, this is a tube that was built and developed in 1950 under the direction of Ademir Zorikhan. It's a photoconductive tube, and this is the actual photograph of the 1952 description in Electronics magazine. The camera tube is 6 inches long and 1 inch wide. It's magnetically deflected, and in the photograph up here you can see that the electron is a little difficult to see with that. Hold it. Okay. This is the exhaust tip of the Vidicon. When it was built, there's a little exhaust tip there, and the cathode sent the electrons up to a photoconductive target, and it was scanned vertically and horizontally with a magnetic deflection coil, just like a television receiver, but it's just a tiny little tube. The signal is taken off the front end of the tube, and this is called a target. And there's a photoconductive surface, and there's the image focused on the opposite side. And essentially, you had elements on that target itself that were photoconductive instead of photo generation or photovoltaic cells. And in some of the other tubes, this was a conductive material, and the scientists at RCA used different types of material to get the response of a human eye, both the color response of a human eye from infrared on up to violet. And the load resistor for the signal is right down here, which is attached to that target. The target ran at about 30 volts, and there's 300 volts up on this wall of a screen on the tube itself. There are various grids to accelerate it and deaccelerate it, and the only difference between the camera that I want to talk about and this camera that's shown was that the Walkie-Lookie did not use focusing coils. There's a focus coil here and here. Those are the two halves of it, and it had 6,500 turns of number 24 wire, and I weighed a focus coil for a Vidicon, and it weighs about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds. So they could save 14% of the 8-pound weight of the camera, or the 10-pound weight of the camera, 9.5 pounds, and bring it down to 8 pounds by simply putting Alnico magnets in little rods along the side here, and they had 40 Gauss of magnetic flux density that way, and they eliminated the focus coil at all and eliminated 1.5 pounds. This camera, the Walkie-Lookie used that concept, and so did the original RCA TVI that's on display over in the other building. It uses that Alnico magnet arrangement instead of an actual focus coil. All the cameras that I've ever built used the focus coil. Okay? The Vidicon tube that was used, it was a C76-192 Vidicon, which I'm sure is long obsolete. The camera also had a 2-stage video preamp, and the article does not mention that. It mentions the preamp as being 2-stage, but doesn't give the values, the tube numbers. And a 6AG5 was the input tube with a cathode follower of a 12AT7. A.D. Cope was one of the developers of the Vidicon, and you can see on this drawing at the bottom drawing that there's an exploded view of the target, and you can see the glass surface, and you can see the scene coming through, and then the photoconductive surface, and then the target coming off here again, just a blow up of that section there. But A.D. Cope went on to develop the 1/2-inch Vidicon tube. By 1956, RCA had a 1/2-inch Walkie-Lookie, 1/2-inch tube, 3 inches long by 1/2 inch in diameter. The resolution was not as good as the 1-inch, and they made a compromise, and that's why you see 1-inch Vidicons and 2/3 inch Vidicons, because the 1/2-inch just did not have the resolution. A.D. Cope worked, and so did S.M. Thompson. Thompson was the one that put the materials into the tube, into the target, to get a good spectral balance. Those of you that have ever used a Vidicon tube will note that as it gets dark, if you're on an outside scene, you're amazed at how well it picks up a picture in twilight, not twilight, twilight between sunset and night. It's amazing how long you can get a picture before it just loses the picture itself. Of course, both cameras had deflection coils, and this is a Vidicon deflection coil. And into the deflection coil went the Vidicon, like so, like that. And so it's a pretty compact package. You just put the lens in front of that, and you're ready to go. Okay. Now we'll go look at a block diagram of what they were carrying around. This is on the right. You'll see the camera and the backpack transmitter, and on the left you'll see the control receiver. Most of the receivers, and the video was transmitted on UHF, 593 megahertz approximately, over to the receiver, and then the sound was transmitted during the horizontal sync pulse. And I'll show you that a little bit later. Going back the other way from the receiver was a VHF signal at 154 megahertz that came back, and you had audio going back to the cameraman, and there was a little microphone mounted in the back of the camera down here, and the control operator of the camera could get instructions that way to change the scene or pick out different things to televise. At the same time, there was a 60 hertz control signal going back to keep the two sync generators locked together. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. The backpack system weighed 45 pounds or 53 pounds with the camera. It was battery operated. It had a 525 line 30 frame interlaced picture, a standard picture. Okay, we'll go on to backpack set now. And on the set itself, you'll see that there is a Vidicon camera. On top of that, or to the side of it, is a 1-inch monitor tube and the video amplifier. Deflection was in the backpack, and it came up to deflect the camera coils. Okay, we have a synchronizing generator that's sending the signal from its signal to the deflection yoke. And notice that the synchronizing generator is feeding the audio modulator. So the horizontal pulse was sent out to an audio modulator, and that was used to modulate this 594 megahertz transmitter. And then you had video coming in this direction. So that was what was being transmitted back to the control unit from the backpack. And over on the camera pack, you had a VHF receiver, and you had 60 hertz going into the sync generator from that, and you also had the audio going out as instructions to the cameraman. This is the most complicated schematic that was published in the article in June of '52, and this is the simplified drawing of the synchronizing generator. And if you'll bear with me for a little bit, this is a 31,500 kilohertz blocking oscillator. And the blocking oscillator output signal feeds a buffer stage. All these are 12AU7s. The buffer stage isolates the following circuitry from the oscillator to keep it as stable as possible. And you fed it from this half of the 12AU7, you went up and fed another blocking oscillator, which divided by 2. So for every 2 pulses going in, you got 1 pulse out. This would give you 15,750 hertz. We call them CPSs in those days, but hertz, and that would give you the output for the horizontal pulse, both a negative and a positive. The grids are tied together on that 12AU7, and then that also drove through another buffer stage, another signal into the blocking oscillator, and this blocking oscillator divided it down to 2100 hertz. So from 31,500, you divided by 15, and that brought it back down to 2100 hertz. They evidently had a little difficulty getting this first blocking oscillator. I don't know how many of you have worked with television blocking oscillators from the 50s, but they were very tricky, and they aged, the capacitors aged, and the time constants changed. RCA put a little tank circuit in here of a capacitor and a resistor, a capacitor and an inductor, and I worked this out with my calculator, and the values are given, and I came up with a resonant frequency of 4,800 hertz. And so they evidently were trying to get rid of the second harmonic. It doesn't come out exactly even, but maybe they just used the values that they had. And that eliminated some of the false triggering. But it's somewhat easy to divide by 2 or 3, but when you try to divide by 15, that becomes pretty tricky. That fed another blocking oscillator. We got up here and we divided by 7. So for every 7 pulses going into the second blocking oscillator, we only got, coming out of that, we had 300 cycles. And then that was divided down by 5 again for 60 cycles. So now we have the vertical pulse rate. We have a vertical pulse coming out of one phase here and another phase off the plate. That fed an early phase detector. So you've got the output signal, the 60 hertz, and we've got a phase detector system here, and it's amplified, and it goes back and fools with the bias on all of the oscillators, all the blocking oscillators. And you can see the individual trimming blocking oscillators they would use to adjust. First the master at 31,500, then they would adjust the 2100 hertz, the divide by 15, and then the 300 hertz divide by 7, and then the 60 hertz divide by 5, and there are the little controls for it. Time constants are slightly different, and they're adjusting that whole bias arrangement and trying to get multiple blocking oscillators. This was a very simple one because it only used 4 tubes, and it used a common 12AU7 that we're all familiar with. Used 4 of them for the entire sync generator, which was an amazing piece of engineering, probably the most remarkable in the entire project. Okay, this one's my favorite. This one is the transmitter section. And the transmitter section, what went on in that arrangement was that you took a crystal frequency of 49496 and you tripled it with a crystal cut to triple it to 48.49, which was used for the local oscillator of the receiver. Then that was doubled to come up with 296.98, and that was doubled to come up with 593.96. The doubler is located right up here, okay, and that's a 5870 triode, and then the final is a 5876 triode. Both tubes were run grounded grid. Grounded grid, for those of you that haven't studied these tubes lately, was used in an amplifier, an RF amplifier. If you use a grounded grid, you eliminate the need to neutralize the amplifier. You do not have to have neutralizing coupling capacitors to neutralize it, and it prevents the amplifier from taking off and oscillating on any frequency it wants to. So that's what's going on. It had a 2-watt output, and the drawing, the published drawing, showed tank circuits. In reality, according to the text, they used a half wavelength open circuit as a coaxial cable cut up as the tuning elements. And I did a little calculation to come up playing with that, and that would indicate that the half wavelength circuits would be about 6.5 inches long with a velocity factor of the cable of 66%. I don't know what they did, and this is speculation, but it's not shown on the drawing. They showed it with tank circuits. I don't know whether they're trying to prevent somebody from copying it and didn't show exactly how it worked or not. But with a half wavelength, which was again a little different because normally you use quarter wavelengths to impedance match, but this used a half wavelength. That way, I guess you could put 2 tubes together and pick out whatever impedance you wanted, and at a half length there would be a phase inversion. If you use quarter wavelength, you won't have a phase inversion. So that's evidently how they matched it. Unbelievable piece of engineering. The designer of the pencil triode circuits were G.H. Rose, and he was a friend of Vladimir Zworykin. There were 2 Rose, people named Rose, that were friends of Vladimir Zworykin. One was Albert Rose and one was G.H. Rose. When you use a grounded grid circuit, it takes a lot of drive. And it also takes a lot of modulation. It takes 100 volts of modulation to modulate this transmitter. And to do that, they used 2 pentodes in series. And the video comes in here, and we heard Wayne talk about clippers. Well, there's a clipper circuit, very similar to what he was talking about with the tube, 6AL5. And so this is the DC restorer, and it came in to the grid. And on a pentode tube, if you remember your tube theory, a pentode tube is controlled primarily by the grid signal. And the plate voltage can be lower than normal or can move around and does not affect plate current that much. So that's why a pentode was used at that point. So these 2 tubes are in series. Voltage here on the plate's not too critical because the screen grid is actually operating as a plate at the same time down here, okay? The second 6AN5 is wired in series coming into the transmitter itself, so it's bootstrapping itself up to 100 volts of drive. When this tube starts to conduct, the voltage drop across the 300 ohm resistor increases, driving the grid negative to turn it off. So that is the supply going out to the tank circuit. for both tubes, the driver and the output tube itself. So video's coming in here, it's getting boosted or bootstrapped with a 250 volt power supply with these two tubes, and the sync pulse is very cleverly put in here by itself where it hit the grid of the triode. Now, we said the grid was grounded. I forgot to tell you that it's AC grounded but not DC grounded. So when you put the positive going pulse here, you generated the sync pulse, and all television systems use the sync pulse as a maximum signal. Beautiful circuit, very simple, unbelievable. Okay, let's go on down to the sound system. The sound system is quite unique. It is a multivibrator, and if you look over on this side, it's a 12AU7 again, and it's an astable cathode-coupled multivibrator, and there's a coupling capacitor, and then the common resistor in the cathode couples the two cathode circuits together. The audio is coming in here and hitting this grid. The sync pulse, the horizontal sync pulse, the leading edge is coming into this tube and being amplified here, and it is controlling the leading edge of the horizontal sync pulse. It does not affect the trailing edge. The audio is affecting the trailing edge, and that sound modulates the entire audio system within the horizontal sync pulse. Okay, so you look at the output over here, and now we've got the modulated audio going out, and what's varying is the leading edge. What's held constant is the leading edge, and what's varying is the trailing edge of the sync pulse itself as it's passed on. Very simple, three effect tube sections, one 12AU7 here, and another tube over here as just the audio sync pulse modulator and the multivibrator. Very brilliant design. And if we look up over here, you can see the horizontal sync pulse, an actual scope shot of it, and you can see there's the sync pulse, just like Wayne had on his, and you can see the length of it. Now this is zero modulation, normal sync pulse. Here's 100% modulation. You can barely see the width of the pulse. They could get 7,000 cycles out of this. Okay, let's go on. Okay, this is going to be back at the TV receiving unit, and they used a standard television receiver up here, just a plain old television receiver, a UHF. Now remember, this was double sideband AM. So you had a positive half and you had a negative half. You had one sideband that was positive that you could tune in, and you had the negative picture if you tuned to the opposite sideband. So the whites were black and the blacks were white. The positive sync was negative if you reversed it. Okay, the synchronizing generator was wide band. It was a wideband generator, so we had the video coming out of that synchronizing, did I say generator? I meant separator. The synchronizing separator had a video signal coming out of one part of it, and it also had the sound coming out of the opposite side. The video amplifier picked up the video signal. It didn't have to worry about differentiating the horizontal from the vertical because we didn't transmit any vertical. No vertical was transmitted. When you got over here, then we've got the leading edge synchronizing a second generator, and this was a standard RCA sync generator, the kind that Chuck Ferris has got over there running this morning. And then the trailing edge is integrated over here, and now you've got the sound coming out of the horizontal sync pulse. The horizontal sync pulse was differentiated so that you only had the positive pulse left. Differentiated and clipped, I should say. You did both. So you only have the leading edge coming out. We went down to the composite out, and at that point, then the synchronizing generator put in the standard NTSC equalized pulses so that the monitor didn't roll. The VHF transmitter ran at, I said 154, which is 6 megahertz above the 148 crystal frequency. And you've got the 60 hertz signal being sent to the camera unit, and also the instructions to the camera operator on the same VHF transmitter. Supply was a 60 amp hour silver cell storage battery, and it used a dynamotor. Some of us remember dynamotors. For those younger folks, the dynamotor was a DC motor attached to a generator, and it was heavy on your back, and this was mounted in that backpack, and it generated a plus 50 volt and a 250 volt power supply elements or windings on the dynamotor. Half of the power in this unit was used to light the filaments of the tubes, 50%. The whole unit consumed 150 watts at 60% efficiency, and it ran an hour and a half on a single charge. When this unit was designed, the man who designed the microphone, and this is strange because the microphone I mentioned was mounted in the back of the camera, probably a little small condenser mic, and I'm speculating on that. The designer of the microphone was Dr. H.F. Olson. You may remember Dr. H.F. Olson from his famous book, Music, Physics, and Engineering. I think it had an earlier title, but it was one of the textbooks used in a lot of classes on audio and music. He also was the designer of the famous RCA 44 series and 77 series broadcast microphones, which most of you would recognize, the diamond mics and the little pill capsule mic that was the 77. The 1-inch monitor tube was designed by Dr. F.H. Nicole. And when you look at the names in these articles that I have about 4 or 5, when you look at the names, you see all these names over and over and over. And Steve has on the website, he has that photograph, the collection of Zorican photographs. If you haven't gone to that point on the site, do it, because you'll see some of the names of these designers popping up in that RCA research lab of the 1950s. And you'll see their photographs. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I missed on the sync generator system. Okay, the articles that I have talk about 2 different types of ranges. Some of them say 1 mile and others say 1/4 mile. And about 60 years ago this summer, they were evidently at Camden, New Jersey, experimenting with the power for these transmitters run with the 2-watt signal and a ground plane antenna on top of the camera pack or the backpack. Those of you, or as I remember seeing these pictures in those days, the picture would roll and you'd lose sync and lose signal and everything else, and they'd cut to it, and just about the time you want to see something important, then sync would roll or something would happen. So it was not real stable by today's standards by any means, but it certainly did work. The tests were used, I like to say, with the famous NBC test pattern. I don't know why we have to throw these test patterns in. It must be something in our blood. Test patterns kept showing up today. Yes. This is the NBC RCA television system photograph or a test pattern that was used by NBC New York for a long time. If we went through that pretty fast, I'd like to break for questions. I think a lot of you probably will have questions about this. Richard? Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. Okay. Okay, well, that's interesting because I knew that in the 1956 camera that they built, they used a 1-inch Vidicon yoke, that like I've got here, for the monitor tube. So I bet it was the same tube. I didn't know that. I'm glad you brought that up. Makes sense, doesn't it? I didn't know that. By the way, while we're talking about Vidicon tubes, some of you may still have access to Vidicon tubes. If you have a broadcast Vidicon, it will not work in most industrial closed-circuit cameras because the common tubes in the industrial Vidicon cameras, do not use pin number 3 or grid number 3. It's not necessary. If you put a broadcast Vidicon in an industrial camera, it will not work unless you run a jumper wire between pin 3 and pin 6. Pin 3 was a parabola that was generated from the horizontal sweep pulse, and it had a parabola waveform, and that parabola waveform was used to keep the corners of the broadcast cameras in better focus. It was not deemed necessary for the other type industrial cameras or surveillance cameras. So grid 3, 4, and 5 should all be tied together, and it's pin 6.
From the base to the camera, did they advance the sync so that to account for delay, or did they just glitch?
It was just glitched. It was just glitched, and it rolled, and it might roll horizontally or vertically. And I mean, as a camera warmed up, Chuck tells us it takes about 20 minutes to warm up those RCA big sync generators, and on your backpack, they get warm and then we can change or something. So it was not very stable. Yes, sir. Well, they did. I'm working on the circuitry that was used in the U.S. government Navy ship publication called Radar Electronic Fundamentals, and I'm looking at circuits that existed in 1944 in June when it was published that could have been used or we wound up using later. And yes, they were using inverters in 44. And why RCA didn't do it, I don't know. But yes, and I'm amazed at the number of circuits that existed in the earlier days. Yes, sir. Oh. Yeah, good. That's a good point. That's a good point. And everything was pretty compact on that. The vertical sync came out of the EI8 generator or the NTSC generator in the control unit. So it was generated. It was inserted back in the end from the control receiver. Well, because it was the 60 cycle signal was being sent over, and so the exact multiple, when you multiplied that up back to the 31,500 oscillator, you had the exact ratio. So what was happening was, on one end you were transmitting 60 cycles out, and on the other end you were sending back the leading edge of the horizontal pulse, and you can see it coming in up there on this synchronizing generator. So the arrow between sound separator and synchronizing generator was only the leading edge of the horizontal sync pulse, but you were sending the 60 cycle pulse, so you can see it entering the VHF transmitter. You were sending it in and then having it phase lock within the circuitry. So you didn't transmit it, just like you don't transmit green in color. It's there if we synthesize it, so that's what they were doing.
Two more questions in the back.
Yes? I'm not familiar with that. I know I do have the circuitry and the article from Electronics Magazine of the 1956 circuit, which is more detailed than these. I do have that. I know in 64, RCA or NBC had this other walkie-lookie that was solid state, and the 1956 version of this was solid state, so they made some tremendous advantages.
Last question. Who's in? Go ahead.
Boy, if there were, I would try my best to have one here. They're gone. Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. I really enjoyed this.
Gary, you taught us something. I just got a note, the RCA files from New York about consumer products are now at Indiana Historical Society. And Dave is helpful and is willing to look into them. If you need more information, see Dave about the consumer products. I know you guys are interested on the other end, the transmitters, the receivers, the behind the scenes, the industrial parts. But consumer was a great part of RCA's financial success. So anyway,
Can I mention that if you need, would like to look at these articles, the originals, the original electronics article about the Vidicon in simplified television, the RCA camera adapter, or this article, if you will see, my wife or I, Sandy Davis, will stand up. Sandy, stand up. Sandy, stand up. She's the computer person. If you'll just leave us with your email or email us, she'll give you our email, and I would love to be able to copy those and send those to you if you're interested in reading those, the direct articles. Thank you.
great. Dave, don't go away without seeing me. Next, Richard Deal, where are you hiding? Come on up, Richard. Don't be bashful. Tell us about the picture phone. I saw one in 1964 at the New York World's Fair, and it didn't look like the one you brought.
No, that's a Model 1. Okay. I'm going to talk about Model 2, and the title of my presentation's not quite accurate. It was what I rushed out when Steve asked for the thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about the picture phones themselves and give a little bit of technology about it without going in depth, and then talk about my recent experience trying to make a pair of them work to bring here this year. That didn't happen.
You use fiber optics instead of copper.
I wish. Alexander Graham Bell invented the phone in 1876 and changed the world. It allowed people to speak to each other over great distances. Our friend John Logie Baird was able to send pictures a while later in 1926. And of course, it was just an obvious marriage to put the two things together. And here's a great idea: combine the TV and the telephone. And so the work began on it. Bell Labs undertook this, and in 1927, Herbert Hoover was transmitted to, let's see, I got to read my own notes. His Secretary of Commerce sent his picture over existing phone lines from Washington, D.C. to an auditorium in Manhattan. This was the first public demonstration in the United States of long-distance video transmission. The technique was now proven viable, but still too experimental to proceed with any haste. By 1956, we now have viable technology. Bell Labs scientists developed several experimental video telephone systems by varying the size and appearance, which offered commercial possibilities. The one shown here was demonstrated before the Institute of Radio Engineers on August 23rd. This was the first system to transmit and receive recognizable pictures over ordinary phone lines. This was a slow scan system that sent one frame every 2 seconds. In 1963, they developed the Model 1 system. The complete experimental picture phone system had been developed. The station set included the camera, receiver, loudspeaker unit, and a separate combination telephone set video control unit. The system transmitted 120 line images 30 times a second with 2-to-1 interlace. Bandwidth is 0.5 megahertz. Limited commercial picture phone service between public locations in 3 cities, New York, Chicago, and Washington, began on June 25th of 1964. The service was inaugurated with a call from Mrs. Lyndon B. Johnson in Washington, D.C. to Bell Laboratory scientist Dr. Elizabeth Wood. As a result of earlier trials, significant equipment and operational changes were made in the picture phone system. The modified equipment was used in a product trial begun in July of '65 in cooperation with Union Carbide. In December the same year, an experimental trial began at AT&T headquarters in New York. By June 7th,